To talk about the spirituality of the mountain today is not easy, especially because in many cases it has become commonplace. Probably few eras before our own have heard so much talk about the spirit. The spirit and the spiritual have almost been turned into a sort of condiment, used to spice all kinds of dishes. This generalization, however, is in stark contrast with the fact that the contemporary era truly lacks authentically transcendent principles and visions. We should not regard most modern references to spirituality as positive phenomena, but rather as confused aspirations that have no value unless they are to receive further development in a true orientation. In the sense of a firm self-consciousness as a result of contact with some higher reality. At this point, I would like to present my thoughts concerning mountains and alpine sports, and discuss the potential for the true spirituality they contain. First of all, this potential is real, and it does not have anything to do with the fashion trends of our era, or with the short-lived enthusiasm of the younger generations. We know this because the spirituality of the mountain is traditional in the highest, strictest, and most universally understood sense of the word. I have gathered specific proof in an attempt to demonstrate that, since the oldest times, in almost every civilization, the mountain was uniformly regarded as the symbol of inner and transcendent states of being, and as the allegorical seat of divine natures, of heroes, and of transfigured beings, who had been taken beyond the mere human condition. According to various myths, climbing the mountains or being spirited to the peaks symbolized a mysterious transcendent process, a spiritual integration, and a participation in an Olympian immortality. To those who do not agree with the falsifying interpretation of the materialistic and rationalistic 19th century, according to which the ancient myths were nothing but poetry and arbitrary fancies. All this assumes the value of a specific testimony, the most hidden meaning of which needs to be investigated. All these ancient tales, in which recur the theme of the sacredness of the mountain, should be regarded by those people as hints of a spiritual reality, the connection of which with the symbolism of the mountain cannot be accidental. Ancient men did not casually choose the mountain as a means to express meanings that are clearly transcendent. Rather, they were induced to adopt the mountain as a symbol because of the analogy, or better, because of the foreboding that the experience of the mountain caused in the deepest recesses of their being, provided this experience is adequately cultivated. To further analyze what the mountain symbolizes, it is first necessary to reject all the contemporary interpretations of the spirituality of the mountain and of mountain climbing. In other words, it is necessary to limit its scope to subordinate its various conditioned points of view to one absolute point of view. The first of the current assumptions is the purely lyrical view of the mountain. I am referring to the world of literary rhetoric, and the poetry of the worst kind that consists of bourgeois sentimentalism and conventional and stereotypical idealism. From this perspective, the mountain is seen as part of the landscape from a distance and is to be represented as picturesque. Poets describe the mountain in brilliant and exhilarating terms that lack serious content and do not express a sincere and direct experience. The mountain man and the true mountain climber do not share this rhetoric. This rhetoric, which is confined to the aesthetic world of books, is fortunately no longer fashionable, since it is now seen as the residue of 19th century romanticism and as the compensation of a bourgeois generation that only yearned for the snowy peaks through easy verbal enthusiasm, and for commonplaces through verbal lyricism. Second, we find the spirituality of the mountain conceived in terms of naturalism. This is the view of a generation characterized by an opposite sentiment to that which I have just described. This generation may be characterized as the generation of the crisis, which by and large is a German product. Out of an obscure need for an organic, biological, and even psychic compensation, and out of an instinctive revolt against a civilization that has become synonymous with dry intellectualism and mechanical forces, also with utilitarianism and with conformism. What has occurred is an exodus toward nature and the emergence of an absolute need for the mountain to represent that which is anticity and anti-culture. Thus, what has arisen is a new primitivist mysticism in regard to nature and the sports practiced in nature. This new primitivism takes up again most of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas, and the same indictment of civilization that was promoted by people like Nordau, Freud, Lessing, Bergman, and Clanges. Or is it Clangus? In regard to this phenomenon, it is important to avoid misunderstandings. Obviously, there is nothing wrong with the idea that people need to rest, relax, and derive new strength from contact with nature and with the mountain. Indeed, this is desirable. Therefore, mountain sports assume the role of social renovation of unquestionable value, and yet we should not confuse what are very distinct realities and conclude that more or less physical sensations of well-being and organic refreshment have something to do with spirituality. Nor should we believe that a man immersed in a climate of primitivist and naturalist practice is any closer to the essential part of his own being than when he is involved in the disciplines and struggles of civilized life. Escapism, the reaction that accompanies it, and this exaltation of nature, in most cases are enough, due to their negative characteristics, to limit the scope of naturalism. The plane on which the spiritual personality may realize or strengthen its sense of itself is beyond both civilization, in the limited materialistic, social, and intellectualist senses of the term as assumed in recent times, and anti-civilization, which is namely nature, understood as mere antithesis to civilized society. This is the plane I am talking about, not that of the conditions and the best ways to repair or preserve bodies and brains that have been negatively affected by the material and psychic poisons of modern life. Third, it is necessary to overcome the attitude that holds the spirituality of the mountain and of mountain climbing in terms of mere sensations of physical heroism. This is the attitude of the elite who practice climbing seriously and actively. The mountain is spirit in all that it involves: discipline of the nerves and body, clear-minded courage, desire for conquest, and the impulse to engage in pure action in an environment of pure forces. Now, anything that contains a highly educational value deserves to be further qualified. Such a qualification concerns once again the finalities. Just as naturalism has its reasons for being at a certain plane, likewise mountain climbing has its own reasons for serving as a school for the previously mentioned qualities. It is undoubtedly desirable that the younger generations become capable of that spirit of boldness and of that psychophysical fitness that results from the active pursuit of mountain climbing. But is this the highest level to which they may aspire? When we examine the inner aspect of this issue, that is, leaving out of consideration qualities of the younger generations that can and should be appreciated, such as health, energy, and self-discipline, we cannot help but notice the presence among our young people of love for risk and even of heroism. Quite often the value of these qualities amounts to a mere sensation, and their end result is the exasperating view of personality and virility as purely physical, hard, and closed. This modern view is already abnormally developed, and it certainly does not constitute the best condition for the reattainment of a true, liberated, and transcendent spirituality. But it must be recognized that mountain climbing, when experienced only in keeping with this view, would not be easily distinguished from the pursuit of emotions for their own sake. This pursuit of radical sensations generates, especially in the United States, all kinds of extravagant and desperate feats and bold acrobatic activities, such as jumping in mid-air from one plane to another, daredevil stunts, extreme sports, and so on. All things considered, these things do not differ very much from other excitements or drugs, the employment of which suggests the absence rather than the presence of a true sense of personality, and also the need to be stunned rather than to possess oneself. Even the technical component of mountain climbing may easily degenerate. We often find climbers who are automatically inclined, out of habit, to engage in all kinds of ascents, including that of skyscrapers. However, it is certain that if there is an element that is open to understanding a superior realization in the experience of mountain climbing, it is the emotional or sensory element, and yet it is essential to see in that only a starting point, the raw material, and to consider sensory experience as only a means and not as an end to it in itself. Modern man has a totally wrong attitude in regard to what he feels. Sensation is, to him, something that begins and ends in itself and in relation to which he is passive. He is too weak to separate from the sensation or an emotion the purely irrational element, or that which in this sensation is merely an impression or an inner turmoil. He is incapable of deriving from it, with an inner action, something that may be used directly and actively by the spirit as superior knowledge. This is also the case of the experience of the mountain. Those who are irresistibly attracted to the mountains may often only experience in an emotion a greatness that is beyond their understanding. They have not learned to master a new inner state emerging from the deepest recesses of their beings. Thus, they do not know why they seek increasingly wider horizons, freer skies, tougher peaks, or why from peak to peak, from wall to wall, and from danger to danger, through their experiences, they have become inexplicably disillusioned with everything that, in their ordinary lives, appeared to them as most lively, important, and exciting. That which appeals to them and moves them is the powerful inner message that is directly evident in everything in the mountains. The mountain can be destructive and is awesome in its greatness, its solitude, its inaccessibility, its silence, the primordial nature of its storms, its immutability through the succession of seasons, and the constant formation and dissolution of the cloud banks. All these things should be regarded as intimations of immortality. Thus, the mountain could serve as a symbol, and as such it could lead to a corresponding inner realization. More often than not, man stops at the emotional level, which usually has a perturbing quality rather than a feeling of conquest and special knowledge. The irrationality of impressions, visions, of inexplicable elan, and gratuitous acts of heroism urge man forward along ascending paths. Thus he eventually begins to act from an interior motive. It is in the context of the subconscious that he finds himself introduced to a wider reality, through which he is transformed to a state of calmness, self-sufficiency, simplicity, purity. Moreover, he receives an almost supernatural inflow of energies that cannot be explained through the determinism of physiology. He also feels an indomitable will to keep on going, to commit himself again, to challenge new peaks, new abysses, new faces. It is precisely in this drive that we find inadequate the translation of the material action in regard to its meaning, the transcendence of the spiritual impulse in relation to external conditions. To the deeds, the visions, and the bold actions that have propagated its awakening, and that still constitute the necessary material for the concrete expression of that very drive. I do not think it is hasty to conclude that this determination must have been the secret behind the greatest mountain feats ever performed. Those feats that seem to have really transcended the limits of ordinary human possibilities, and yet this level of accomplishment should be accompanied by true realization, and by overcoming the instinctive and irrational element, and by a full and unwavering self-awareness, namely, the transformation of the experience of the mountain into a way of being. Then what would arise is, in the best subjects, is the feeling that every mountain excursion, every climb, every conquest, and every daring feat are only means through which he expresses an immaterial reality that he could also express in other ways. This then is the strength of those who may be said to never return from the peaks to the plains. This is the strength of those for whom there is no longer going out or coming back, because the mountain is in their spirit, because the symbol has become reality, and because all dross has been shed. For these people, the mountain is no longer a new adventure or a romantic escape or a sensory high, or heroism for its own sake, or a sport carried to new technical heights. Rather, the mountain is connected to something that has no beginning and no end, and that, having become an inalienable spiritual conquest, has become part of one's nature, something one carries everywhere, and bestows a new meaning to every action, every experience, and every struggle in everyday life. In this way, beyond the natural symbol of the mountain, which is directly perceived by the senses, we can access its doctrinal and traditional symbolism, namely, the deeper content of all the previously mentioned ancient myths, which in which the mountain appears as the seat of divine natures, immortalizing substances, forces of a solar and supernatural regality. For example, the solar mountain referred to in the traditions of the Hellenized Roman Empire, and the mountain as the seat of Mazdaean glory. A spiritual center, Mount Meru, and the other symbolic mountains conceived as poles, and so forth. In fact, in all this we see the various depictions, personifications, and projections of transcendent states of consciousness, of inner awakenings and enlightenments, These projections are said to be real when they no longer represent something vague, mystical, or fantastic, but rather when they are perceived according to the evidence and normalcy of a superior order that regards as abnormal everything that was previously regarded as familiar and habitual. It is possible that the ancients, who ignored mountain climbing or only knew some rudimentary techniques, and therefore knew the mountain as an inaccessible and inviolable entity, were consequently led to experience it as a symbol and as a transcendent spirituality. Considering that today the mountain has been physically conquered and that there are few peaks that man has not yet reached, it is important to keep the conquest from being debased and from losing its higher meaning. Thus, it is necessary that the younger generations gradually come to appreciate action at the level of ritual, and that they slowly succeed in finding again a transcendent reference point. It is through this reference point that the feats of audacity, risk, and conquest, as well as the disciplines of the body, the senses, and the will that are practiced in the immovable, great, and symbolic mountain peaks, lead men to the realization that all in man is beyond himself. In this way, these feats will be justified in the context of the spiritual revolutionary movement that is currently emerging among our people.